Her name is Sarah Lemos. I always want to, every time I talk to her, I say, yes, read Sarah's work on this, because she was really, she may not have been the first, but she certainly was the first that did a very serious PhD thesis that did it. And I was kind of not fully sold, as you might not be sold by one study. And in the Brazilian literature, they even have a name for this, El Faro, which it's a light, it's a what do you call it? Yeah, yes. And the nature is you set a signal to the whole society that this is the wage that people should be getting. And the informal sector workers who have neighbors who are formal sector workers, they all say, well, that's what we should be getting. And we can think of the same thing as operating in the standards that are put on how your factory should operate. I mean, I don't know of any study that just looked at if we get the standards in some Nike factory. Now that Nike's the great good guy in this world, though they spill over to other factories in the area because the workers say, well, Nike's doing this right. I happen to be working at a different company, you working at Nike, why don't I get the same protections or so on? And I refer to myself here, which gives references to all of this minimum wage, literature and the number of studies. It's just it's very compelling, and it really, let me just say, it goes against what economists originally thought. So we originally thought you put a minimum wage in the formal sector, they reduce employment, the workers go to the informal sector, and that depresses wages in the informal sector. And you can make the same argument on these standards being put in. Okay, the Nike puts the standards in their factory, they hire fewer people because it's more expensive, and then those workers go off to the other place. And that was one of the major, at least neoclassical economic complaints about the fair trade kinds of things, that it really was going to harm the workers in the worst part of the income distribution. Well, the evidence on the minimum wage is no. Instead, it actually sort of establishes a general economy-wide standard. It's very surprising. Now, I think where we stand now with this, if you accept these arguments or these evidence, I think the evidence is overwhelming at this point, is how do you do this along a supply chain, and can you find innovative ways to do this? Hopefully people will think about that kind of stuff. I keep thinking of, boy, you've got internet. These Chinese workers are incredibly interneted up. They're sort of one of the lead countries in this, even though the government tries to monitor certain things on the internet and keep you from so on. You have hotlines. Workers could just report, send in an email, anonymous email of some sort, to some government or private agency that you'd be able to, because it's very hard for you to go monitor and enforce. So you got to rely really on the workers to do this, and they can report things. Obviously, it's very successful. You could look at companies and you say, do you make part of your incentive pay or promotion depend that you are trying to enforce company codes of conduct? If it is part of the pay of the plant manager, or it is part of the contract written with the supplier, suddenly there's a monetary incentive for them to do this. And if there isn't, the incentive is to cheat. Because I can always say, oh, gee, I'll fob off some of the work to this horrible factory with the kids. That's what in the Gap case, it wasn't their immediate subcontractor. It was their subcontractor who had subcontracted to somebody else, which obviously made more money for them. And so you want to be able to say, no, we pay you for this. Well, it makes sense to focus on the worst things. The other group you think should be involved in this area, local community groups, who also presumably could have some knowledge and should have some. And again, the internet just makes it possible to connect us and groups here with groups there. Certified labels is obviously a very important, but what's the word? It has to be worked out on that. And then I thought of bounty hunters. What would happen if somebody announced that for every violation you find of things in a Nike factory, we pay you $5,000? Well, some people would go out. This is the same way we do bounty hunters to find somebody who broke their bail. Bounty hunters go out. Nobody's tried that. It would be a great and interesting experiment. Because the problem might be that some factory, some subcontractor of, I don't know, Nike or the Gap, would immediately cheat and report themselves and then, correct it. So it'd have to be worked on carefully so that it would operate. And then I put question marks because I don't know what creative ideas other people have. I think that's the issue, is how can we, in a modern world, where we have internet, we have all kinds of things, can we figure out better ways to enforce this stuff? It's not just enforce, it's just get improvements rolling along the line. And then I said, we're always going to find that they break the standards. There's always going to break the law. And we have to understand that, particularly if you have a label, that the label does not mean that the product is made under good conditions. It means somebody is trying to, and somebody else feels that they're trying hard enough that they got the label. There'll always be somebody who might be cheating across the way. That's just, the way it is. Okay, now I want to talk about the biggest change in standards we've had in the world, and the one that is, maybe it's going to lead into something President Nelson is going to talk about tomorrow. First, I quoted Napoleon, and he was not referring to labor standards. But China went through a big process of introducing this new labor law, which took effect on January 1 of this year. And the law there were versions of it, and what is amazing to me is the extent to which globalization affected their national labor law. First of all, the US Chamber of Commerce in China spoke in as strongly as they conceivably could to make the law weak and toothless. They did not want China to have a decent labor standards law because they felt it was going to cut into their profits. The European Chamber of Commerce also spoke that way, but the European unions and the European citizenry forced the European Chamber of Commerce in China, this is the chamber to reverse their position. The American Chamber won a lot of weakened things, and they finally did enact this law on June 29th. And you can ask why the Chinese government was interested in improving labor standards in China if the more conservative economists were right. This is going to hurt their comparative advantage, and they're going to lose sales to the rest of the world. Well, China's got a lot of social problems that you may or may not see written up in the papers. If you pay attention, you'll see there was just the most recent one was, I don't know, it's usually 10,000 people every year die in mine disasters. And there's a new minister of whatever it is, health and safety, and occupational health and safety in China who's pledging he's going to do something. Well, he's got to learn the only thing he probably will work will be to have some freer trade unions and have them organize the mines. That may work. It also may not work that well, but they have. So I just put all their things. And they are looking upon higher labor standards and worker rights as an insurance against the society exploding at some point because the inequality will have reached horrific things. I don't think China has any chance of exploding as long as they run, they're having an economic growth rate of 9 or 10%. But give China 1 or 2 years of a 1% growth rate, and I think the whole society would start wobbling in a very serious way. And what I think may not be that important, but that is the views of the Communist Party. They think their hold on power is not as strong as we might otherwise think. Well, this is, I already told you about the American Chamber of Commerce and also there's the US-China Business Council and the EU, they objected. And look at the complaints that were being made by them when they wanted to put these higher standards in. Companies will have to have human resources capability in the country. So that means that the Western countries would have to have the same sorts of internal human resources divisions that while they work for the company are basically there to make sure the company, they're meant to help workers. Not so that they harm profits, of course. And they don't have that, a lot of this. They haven't put this kind of stuff in. And then they worried about the union in this thing. This is the response, and again, it's a globalization response. So I've never met Professor Chang, even though he spoke at Harvard at my program.